The following is Class 11 of the Yoga Sutras, given by Hridayananda Das Goswami in fall of 2004 in San Luis Obispo. Mantra 2 of Sri Ishopanishad will be discussed for the first 13 minutes. Then Sutras 3.1 to 3.8 will be covered.
I think lends credence to the philosophical notion, which has been around for a long time, that there is such a thing as a philosophia perennia, a perennial philosophy, a type of universal wisdom, which manifests obviously in different ways in different ethnic traditions, historical conditions, and so on. But essentially, at the root, there is a type of universal wisdom. So now, having said that, we have this very interesting statement. So we can chant this. We'll start with each word. And okay. Kurvan eveha karmani jijivishe shatam sama evam vai nanyadeto sti na karma likyate nare. There are actually some words combined there for euphonic effect to make it sound good. According to Sanskrit rules, like for example, aveha is eva iha, and nanyateto is actually na. It's actually three words: na anyatha itaha. I just mentioned that just to, since this is being recorded, and I don't want to be busted on this. So now we'll chant this, perhaps 1/4 at a time. Kurvaneveha karmani Kurvaneveha karmani Jijivishechatam sama Jijivishechatam sama Evam tvai nanyate tosti Evam tvai nanyate tosti Na karma lipyate nare Na karma lipyate nare Yes, actually, evam tvai nanyate to, evam tvai nanyate to. And actually, sti goes in the last line. I mean, semantically, it kind of goes with evam, the evam part, but technically, to chant it properly, sti should go in the fourth part, so I'll do it next time that way. Otherwise, I know you would raise a hue and cry. Kurvaneveha karmani Jijivishechatam sama Evam tvai nanyadeto Stina karma lipyate nare. So, the English here is performing actions exclusively understood in this consciousness, in this life. One may aspire to live for 100 years, thus there is no other way for you. For acting thus, karma does not pollute a person. And so, actually, I'm going to take a few minutes and explain this verse, what all the words mean and everything. So, kurvan. Kurvan is simply the present participle of the verb to do or to make, doing. And eva. Eva has the sense of precisely or only or exactly. In other words, doing precisely this. Kurvan eva, and then iha, it's actually eva iha. But iha means here in this life, in this world. So it has that sense. Like, for example, commonly in Sanskrit you'll find iha amudra. In this life, in that life, in the next life, in this life, in the next life. So iha means in this life, here in this world. Kurvan eveha karmani, so doing karmas. Karma, although it, of course, idiomatically comes to mean the system of actions and reactions through many lives, literally it means action. Just something that someone does, an act in action. So, and this is the plural, karmani, so performing actions, doing actions precisely in this way in this life. Jijivishe, the verb here is ji, to live. Like jiva in Sanskrit, how you say viva, live. And so jijivishe is a desiderative form. It means one may or should or can desire to live. Shatam, 100 sama years. Shatam, of course, in Sanskrit related to our word century, centum in Latin, and cien in Spanish, cien. So there are many. So it's a very common word in Indo-European languages. Shatam, 100 samaha years. Now, what does this mean? There is a teaching which is sort of standard, found throughout the Vedic literatures. It's sort of a very standard teaching that the Earth passes through 4 great planetary seasons, which are called yugas, and or epochs or ages, which last for hundreds of thousands of years. And in each age, let's say in the Satya Yuga, the age of truth, people live for 100,000 years, and it's sort of like an age of wisdom. Very nutritious food sort of grows naturally from the earth. In other words, if you just sort of take a field and don't do anything to it, you don't get weeds. You actually get like fruits and vegetables and all the good stuff. And for us, anyway, from our point of view. And grain. So the earth produces food naturally. People don't have to work very hard. There's no industry. And basically the world, human civilization, lives in spiritual ashrams. People practice yoga and meditate, live very long lifetimes. And the focus of human civilization is simply spiritual knowledge. And that's called Satya Yuga, the age of truth. And then the next age called Treta Yuga, the duration of life is diminished to 10,000 years. It doesn't be a pattern. The duration of life goes from 100,000 to 10,000 years, so it's 10 times less life, 10,000 years. By the way, you find similar descriptions, not exactly the same, but very similar in ancient Greek writings like Hesiod, for example, and even hints of this in Homer also. So, and it said that dharma, or virtue, or spirituality, or religiosity is diminished by 1/4. The duration of life decreases, and virtue decreases. And then the next age, the third age, is called Dwapara Yuga, in which the duration of life again is divided by 10, so it goes from 100,000, 10,000 to 1,000. And virtue loses another 1/4, so it's now down to half. And life gets heavier, in the sense that there's less virtue and people are less wise and more materialistic, and so things are just coming down like this. And then finally you get to this glorious age, the Kali Yuga, in which again the duration of life is diminished by 10, is divided by 10. So you get 100 years, which is sort of like the maximum life, approximately in this life, in this age. And virtue is decreased again. It's only 1/4 of what it was and still going down. So finally, sort of at the end of this age, it becomes kind of nil. And then there's all kinds of trouble breaks out. And then another age of truth comes. So this Yuga system is not the teaching of a particular school in India. This is sort of like a universal understanding of the culture in many different schools and traditions. And so here's a reference that one may aspire to live for 100 years. In other words, the idea is that if one is God conscious, then one can aspire for the best possible life in this age. That's kind of what it means. It's a very beautiful saying they have in Sanskrit. In the Mahabharata, you see this a lot, where a blessing that people give is, may you live for 100 autumns. Because the word for autumn in Sanskrit is sharad, so sharada shatam. So it became a saying, a blessing to live for 100 autumns. So here one may aspire to live for 100 years, and evam, thus, twayi, for you, or in you, na anyata ito asti. There's nothing else from There's no other way besides this. Ethos means, besides this. There's no other way for you except God consciousness. That's the idea. There's no other way for you, because if one does act in this consciousness, then na karma lipyate nare. Literally, karma does not stick to a person. Nare, to a person. Doesn't stick to the... Is there any water? Karma, it also means, lipyate, I translated to pollute. Karma means to stain, lift. The verb lift can mean to attach, to stick to something here, but not exactly in a good sense, the sense of kind of getting smeared by something or like polluted by something, soiled. It could also mean to soil, to stain, to pollute, to contaminate, to stick on you, something like you don't want sticking on you. And so that's the word that's used here, that karma will not stick to you. And this is a common theme in the literature, that this is in the Bhagavad Gita, for example. You have the same word, I think. Anyata, let me think. What is that? Yagyata karma, anyatra and anyata are synonymous. You have a very similar statement in the Bhagavad Gita to this statement in the Upanishads, that where Krishna says that this world is karma bandha, karma bondage. Because we do something, we get a reaction, we have to come back to collect our prize, our karma, good or bad. And we have to take birth again, which means you have to die again, and the wheel turns. So Krishna says that there's only one loophole to this cycle of karma. The only loophole to karma is if we perform acts as an offering, as a devotional offering to God. And East Upanishad is saying the same thing here, that there's no other way if you want to become free from this stain of it, karma. A stain in the sense that the soul, if you consider, just maybe like little two columns, like the properties of the soul and the properties of the body. Again, the body is not evil, the body is the creation of God, but the body is temporary, the soul is eternal. The body is limited, the soul is unlimited. The body, life in the body means there's a lot of stuff we don't understand. There's so much ignorance in the world, people don't communicate, and there's not, but the soul knows everything. And so for the soul, we kind of have this thing put on you. Of course, we do the best we can with it. We take care of it, use it, change the oil and everything. But ultimately, we don't want to come back and have to again go through this, because we could have a life which is eternal, which is infinitely beautiful, a situation where there are perfect loving relationships between people and perfect understanding. And so therefore, here this ancient Upanishad is saying that if you don't want to be covered or stained or contaminated or have this karma stick to you, then you have to work in this consciousness that nothing belongs to me. Certain things are under my care, of course. And the things that are under our care, we have to take care of very nicely, like the body, or whatever. But always with the consciousness of your serving, of your offering. And this is the way out of karma, according to the Upanishads and according to the Gita. So, any questions on that? If not, Patanjali awaits us. Today we are starting the third section, the third of four sections of the Yoga Sutras. So this section begins, Desha Bandhas Chittasya Dharana. So here, in the first three statements of this section, Patanjali is going to explain the last three angas of the Ashtanga Yoga system, the last three angas, the last three limbs. So here's a definition, very simple. He says that concentration, dharana, which literally means like holding in your mind. Concentration is binding consciousness to a single place. Desha bandha, the place binding chittasya of consciousness. And of course, as I've said many times, the Yoga Sutras begin, isn't the very first sutra, is the definition of yoga. Yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodha. So here again, talking about chitta and nirodha, the way to stop the mind from turning, vritti, turning off the path is you've got to fix it in the right place. The mind has to be fixed. And so that fixing of the mind, desha bandha, is dharana. That's what the word dharana, or that's the definition of what dharana means as an anga.
So is chitasya what you're saying, consciousness?
Chitasya means of chitta, of consciousness. Yeah. So it's like the bandha, the binding, chittasya, of consciousness, desha, in a place. Desha means place. That is dharana. And then in contrast, or in comparison, tatra. Tatra means there. Pratyaya ekatanata dhyana. Dhyana, the meditation, is the state, ta, of fixing awareness on a single object. And ekatana is fixing on a single, pratyaya, here's a word for consciousness or awareness, pratyaya. And pratyaya ekatana ta, the state of fixing in one place your consciousness, there, that's dhyana. So what is the difference? And what is the difference here between dharana and dhyana? Oh, on a single object. I'm sorry, I didn't give you a chance to answer. In the sense that dharana seems to be fixing consciousness in a particular state, like you're in a particular state of consciousness. For example, a state where you're peaceful, or a state where you're not distracted, a state where you don't let your mind wander. But then once you're in that steady state, once you're... What?
Then you go into it.
Yeah, then you have to find the object. You have to actually get a specific object within that state and really focus on it. So in this, it seems to me that dharana here is sort of like a cognitive context. You have to create a certain situation for consciousness. It's fixed in a place, a desha. And within that desha, within that place, there's an object. It's like, let's say you move to, like I've come to San Luis Obispo, so now I'm fixed in this place. And then within this place, I have to find the proper object of my work or the object of my consciousness.
In yoga, breath.
Excuse me?
In yoga, it always comes back to the breath and the sound of the breath. Kind of routine in the present moment.
Well, that would seem that it would be like the dharma. Because it's you're fixing your consciousness in that state where you're, and because it's chitta, it's consciousness. Of course, there's awareness. It's a conscious activity. So you're in a particular state. Let's say you're aware.
What is it you're fixing on a single object? The object of breath could be.
Well, ultimately, the meditation is going to be on God, or on your soul, and so the awareness of your breath brings you into the proper state. It's consciously coming to a state in which you can then focus on the spiritual reality. Because then we have samadhi. Tarivarta mata nirvasam sarupa shunyiva samadhi. I gave notice translation because I thought it was fine. There's no need to change it for the sake of changing it. Pure contemplation, which is how she translates samadhi. Pure contemplation is meditation that illumines the object alone. Artha matra. Artha is object and matra means alone. As if the subject were devoid of intrinsic form. So let's look at that. Tadeva. Tadeva artha. Nirbasa. Basa means light, and nir means sort of like out, like shining out, shining forth. So that shining out, or that illumination of the object alone, that, only that, is samadhi, and it's Sarupa Shunya Eva. It's a state of consciousness, Shunya, devoid of Sarupa, one's own nature, as if devoid of one's own nature. The word Eva here is very important, because we do have a nature. In fact, Patanjali has spoken about it before. We have a Sarupa. For example, we are eternally part of the Absolute. We are part of God. We are conscious beings. We have a nature. Patanjali will tell us, or has told us, that the perfection of samadhi is devotion to God, and so therefore we have love within us. And so all that is our nature. Love is our nature. To be conscious is our nature. To be an individual eternal soul is our nature. So therefore Patanjali doesn't say here that you should be devoid of a nature. He said as if. This is a very important distinction because there's a lot of metaphysical teaching out there which says that you should really kind of not have a nature that imposes itself upon the conscious experience. But here Patanjali is more nuanced. He's a little more mature about it. He's saying as if. In other words, in your meditation, or actually in samadhi here, you are so absorbed in the object of your meditation that it's as if you didn't have a nature. So you're not bringing anything, you're just this pure awareness. I'll give you a very practical example of this. There is a beautiful statement in the Bhagavad Purana describing the gopis, the cowherd girls who were Krishna's lovers. And these gopis, these young girls, beautiful young village girls, are always held up as an example of the highest achievement of yoga. It's interesting that in this literature, the greatest yogis, and they never practiced yoga formally, but in the sense of the people who achieved the greatest state of samadhi are always said to be these village girls who were just churning butter, because they had so much love. They were so completely overwhelmed with love that they couldn't think of anything but Krishna. And there's one beautiful statement in the Bhagavatam that they actually forgot their own existence. Now the point here, I give this as they were so absorbed in love that they forgot their own existence. Now they do exist, and they have a nature. These were very beautiful young women, who had this tremendous love and devotion. And there's a very interesting scene. Again, this Bhagavad Purana is one of the most important literatures in India. It's one of the most beloved literatures in Indian religious history. And there's a scene where there was a meeting, I think, what was it, at a solar eclipse, I think. There was a solar eclipse thousands of years ago when Krishna was actually in the world. And so according to the Vedic customs on an eclipse, there were particular religious things they would do. So in this particular eclipse, they all went to this sacred place, Kurukshetra, which is north of Delhi, the sacred field of Kurukshetra. And so it so happened that these village people, cowherd village people, who had raised Krishna as a child, came. But also when Krishna left Vrindavan, he went to the big city. It's like leaving, like how you going to keep down the farm after he's seen Puri. And so Krishna left this village of Vrindavan and became a prince, became a great prince of the Yadu dynasty. This is all very, very well known in India. Everyone knows these things. So as a prince, he was very culturally sophisticated. He lived in a palace, and he had political power, and he acted very much like a prince. And he'd been raised as, just like now, I don't want to say it's like this, but in our culture, the politicians always want to say, I actually grew up in a little town. Like Clinton always likes to say, I was from Hope, Arkansas. It's kind of like a plus that you're from a little town somewhere. And so there's this very poignant meeting where these very aristocratic, very, very sophisticated aristocratic members of this royal dynasty, the Yadu dynasty, met these village people, very simple village people from this cowherd village. But what happened is this royal dynasty, were probably the most powerful people in the world in that civilization, felt they were in awe of these village people. It was all reversed. They actually were not, because they knew that no one loves Krishna as much as these people. And they were actually in awe of these, and they were practically worshipping these simple village people because they knew how much love they had and just and what great spiritualists they were. And so that example is given. Also, even the members of the Yadu dynasty, the other princes, it said that when they would get up in the morning and take baths and dress themselves, they actually weren't even aware of what they were doing because they were thinking of Krishna so much. And so there are actually these historical examples in the tradition where your love becomes so strong spiritual love, that it's as if you didn't have a nature. You don't. It's not the type of unhealthy thing we find to talk about modern psychology, where someone becomes what they call like codependency, or where you sort of like lose yourself in a relationship and it's unhealthy. So it's not that kind of thing. It's not a material, emotional problem. It's the spiritual love. And that's what Patanjali is talking about. As if. Sarupa shunya. Shunya means void or devoid. And so as if devoid of one's own nature. Because the love is so great. And that's what he's going to say, that the perfection of samadhi is this devotion, this dedication. And so it really all ties together if you look at the whole...
You make me sound like a rock star.
What's that?
You make me sound like a rock star.
Krishna?
Yeah.
He kind of was. I mean, he didn't play electric guitar or anything, but if you read, that's what's so, he played the flute. If you read the descriptions of Krishna, it's very much like that. He was, all the contemporary descriptions or the traditions say that he was incredibly good looking. And that people were kind of almost like stunned when they saw him because he was just such an attractive person. And there are even stories when he would be in battle with his enemies because he came, that's one of the famous statements in the text, that he came to rid the world of these sort of evil forces like you see about in the movies we're talking about here. Corporation. So even sometimes when they would come onto the battlefield, even his enemies, these sort of bad guys, would see him, and for a moment they would kind of be shocked because he was so attractive. He was just such a beautiful person. And there's descriptions when Krishna plays flute that in the village that people would become stunned at the sound of the music. And so this was very interesting about this tradition. The emphasis is on the spiritual pleasure and the beauty and falling in love with the absolute. It's very interesting. So it is kind of a rock story. There's another, I can't help telling you this because I find this fascinating. I've done a lot of work in the Mahabharata, this great epic history. And so there were 5 Pandavas, the 5 brothers who were sons of Pandu. Arjuna, who speaks to Krishna in Gita, is the third of 5 brothers. And they're kind of like the protagonists, the heroes of the Mahabharata. And so the youngest boy was Sahadeva, who was also considered to be so attractive that when he was sent out on an official mission to South India to establish political unity, so that everyone would accept a single central government and to avoid fighting and so on. He was out on this very, very serious, grave governmental mission, but he was so good looking. And when he would come to these towns, it was like a rock star. And people were just crowding around him, and he had to say, wait a second, I have something serious to do here. So it's very interesting. They were very attractive people. I find the story great. So, but again, Patanjali is aware of all this. Patanjali lived and wrote within a culture that knew about these things. And so he didn't write in isolation. And so he's saying that it's as if you don't have a nature, but you really do have a nature. And so that's samadhi, when you're seeing what's really there. You're seeing what's really there. And you're not shading or changing the object by what you bring, but not projecting anything onto it.
Not making it surreal or anything.
Yes. That's a very good point you've made. Surreal, because sur in French means over or on top of, so surreal almost means like more than real. And we do sometimes in relationships. We almost impose upon a person greater glory than that person may possess, and then there's the inevitable disappointment. And so, I mean, in many ways, if we could see things very objectively, it'd be a great thing. So then Patanjali says, Trayam, this triad, these 3 things, ekatra. Well, I'll read the translation first. Concentration, meditation, and pure contemplation. In other words, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. That's the triad, 3. Focused on a single object, ekatra, in one place. In one place. The 3 in one place. Samyama, are perfect discipline. That's actually from Miller again, that's why it's in quotations. So samyama I'll write one thing on the board today, because otherwise, Jennifer kindly brought it here. If I don't write anything, I'll kill it.
So it's not the object. It's the action of the concentration. The object is of no consequence.
Oh, the object is very important.
So we haven't gotten to that part yet.
I think in chapter 2 we actually, I'll write that what he said again. Patanjali said, samadhi, siddhi, the perfection of samadhi. Siddhi means a perfection. It also refers to mystic perfections like the siddhis. But the perfection of samadhi is Ishvara Pranidhana, this devotion to God. So, a point I made at the very beginning, I think, of the class, one of the first few classes, is that this is kind of a how-to manual, the Yoga Sutras. And there's a certain neutrality in it. There's a lot of ancient psychology here. Because ultimately, yoga is dealing with consciousness. So it's literally psychology. It's the science of the sukha, the consciousness, the mind, the spirit. And so to a great extent, Patanjali is trying to be somewhat neutral. He's teaching you techniques. And he keeps hinting or saying again, well, the real point is devotion to God. However, he sort of describes the psychology by itself, so you can apply it here or there. So in that sense, you can say there's a certain neutrality in the text. But there's also a recurring theme that the perfection of samadhi really is the devotion to God.
So God is the object.
Oh yes, because that's the highest truth. And in the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, that this is very explicit.
Why didn't you just say that? I heard what you said,
right,
about being neutral, but why dance around about it? I don't know.
I think because, based on my own experience, that when you're teaching, and you want to teach, let's say, the techniques of yoga and the psychology of yoga, and you're teaching within a civilization which is quite diverse, and people have many different beliefs in many different ways. Patanjali, I think, to be fair to him, he's not seen as one of the great spiritual teachers in the sense of someone that really taught, like say Shankara, who taught the particular Vedanta view, or Ramanuja or Chaitanya or Krishna spoke the Gita. Patanjali is certainly the great teacher of yoga techniques and yoga psychology, but it's somewhat neutral. It's more of a how-to book or an explanation. In fact, that's what the word yoga really means, because even in the literature, yoga is contrasted with Sankhya. And the Sankhya is more the philosophy, explaining the philosophy. Yoga, in contrast, is the technique, the application, the process. So Patanjali is referring to the Sankhya, the philosophy, and he's aware of it. And he ultimately does give you the point. He does tell you explicitly that the perfection of samadhi is devotion to God. He says that explicitly. Mm-hmm. But his main focus in giving us this text is in a somewhat neutral way to give us the techniques and the psychology of the system of meditation and yoga, and to lay it out for us. And you find it all the time in our culture. It's very common that, say, someone that writes a book on psychology may hint at his or her own spiritual beliefs, but they're really writing a psychology book. For example, let's say I have a cousin who went to a Christian seminary in Texas and eventually got a master's degree in marriage counseling. And so, as a marriage counselor, of course, he is a Christian, and he's a real Christian. But as a marriage counselor, he can't impose it. If someone comes, let's say a Jewish couple come to him, or an atheistic couple come to him, or a Buddhist couple, or a Hindu couple, he may say, try to throw something in a little here or there. I don't know what his technique is, but basically he can do the marriage counseling in a somewhat neutral way. And so the market will bear it. People will, if he can, he may suggest something more related to his own personal beliefs. And so Patanjali is, that's his career. Patanjali's career was not as, let's say, the leader of a particular spiritual community. He really was almost like, in a modern sense, a great teacher of psychology and yoga technique.
Okay. So whatever their religion could apply the object to whatever was their focus, their God, head, or whatever.
Patanjali is somewhat neutral about it, although he does explicitly say that if you want the perfection, then it's devotion to God. That's really what it leads to. However, he's not, the Gita is, what you're saying, like why didn't you say it clearly, that's the Bhagavad Gita. And so when it says Patanjali didn't have to do it, because someone already did it. And so the Bhagavad Gita is powerful and explicit, and there's no mincing words. And
well, I'm ignorant, that's what I'm asking.
No, you're not ignorant. It's just, you just never did this stuff. So, but the Gita is very strong, so you have a text which is very explicit and powerful. And so Patanjali is just filling in a lot of psychology and technique. Does that make sense? Yes. So I honor Jennifer and wrote that on the board. Oh, I was going to... This word sangyama, sang means completely or perfectly or totally, and yama, we already had. It's actually, yama is one of the, I think it's the first, what's the first anga of yoga, isn't it? Yama and yama. Yeah, it's the first yama. And those are the, what do they call them? The restraints. And then we got a list of yamas. That's the first limb of yoga. So here, with this word sang, which means sort of like, if this is restraint or discipline or self-control, this means like you really got it right. Sang, like perfect or complete discipline or self-control.
And what's the niyama?
Yeah, niyama is often translated observances. Ni is a prefix. And sort of idiomatically means not simply the restraints, which are basically, basic moral principles, but observances, like one should always keep clean, one should study scripture, one should, and so on, those observances. So Patanjali says that, keep track of the time, that the samyama, the complete self-discipline, is when you are able to focus these three, the triad, the three, dharana, jhana, samadhi, in one place. Now, interestingly, I don't know if this has been mentioned by others. I'm sure it has, but I will delude myself into thinking that I'm the first to realize this. That this is really a circle. I mean, you can think of the Ashtanga as a circle which finally completes itself, because it begins with yama, and then after you come to these last three, you get samyama, the perfect yama, or the perfect restraint. So it began with yama, and then it comes to samyama, the perfect yama. So there's a kind of, what would you call that? Coherence, where it's at. It comes back, it goes around, comes around. So then, tajaya, by mastering that, by mastering that, pragya aloka, one beholds wisdom. And mastering that, one beholds wisdom. So, well, in a sense, this addresses what you just mentioned. And that is, what's the object? Because here, you're doing technique. Dharana is an action, it's a technique. Dhyana is an action, it's a technique. And samadhi, it's a state of focusing consciousness perfectly. But ultimately, by mastering these three, you see pragya, which is wisdom. I mean, the goal, you actually get a glimpse of wisdom. And wisdom is not mere technique. I mean, wisdom is never simply a technique. Wisdom is a deep understanding of what's important in life. It's a deep understanding of reality. So the goal here is actually knowledge, wisdom, which comes from mastering these three highest stages of yoga. Then tasya bhumishu viniyoga. This is practice. Viniyoga means like a practice. This is practice in stages. Tasya means of that. Vini yoga, the application of practice. Tasya of that. Bhumishu, in stages. Bhumi, by the way, means the earth. It means the earth or ground or land. And so that's how you say in Sanskrit, in stages. Like this level, that level. Bhumishu in stages. So you practice it in stages. And Trayam Antar Angam Purvevya. In contrast to the former, Purvevya means the former limbs, these three are internal limbs. Trayam, the three are Antar Angam. This is a very important, interesting distinction. That where Patanjali is saying that the first five, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, and Pratyahara, these five, did I say five? Yeah. These five must be external. If you think about that, the Yama, regulating your body, restraining your body, and then Niyama, keeping your body clean, studying, doing, all the Niyamas. And then, of course, Asana, sitting properly. And then Pranayama, breathing properly. And then Pratyahara. Even Pratyahara, interestingly, this gives us a real insight into what Patanjali is talking about. Because Pratyahara, pulling back, is not one of the internal, it's different from Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi. Very interesting distinction to understand these different angas. So there's a sense in which there's a divide. Dharana is the first truly internal stage, whereas Pratyahara is not yet.
What's the first four kind of? The first four, later four, middle, internal, and the first four.
Well, it was interesting. Patanjali is saying 5 and 3.
Oh, 5 and 3, okay.
Yes. So that Pratyahara, which is sort of pulling back your senses, I guess you're not inside yet. You're sort of on the way in.
Pulling, so that means you're in action.
Yeah, you're in action, and your senses are out there, and you're, hauling them in, pointing them back in. Pratyahara. And so it's at the stage of dharana. You're following? Yeah. It's at this sixth stage of dharana that you're really internal now. This is an antar anga, an internal antar, an internal limb of yoga. So these three are the internal stages. Purvevya means from the former, in other words, from the first 5. Or in contrast, in comparison to the former, the first 5. These three are the internal limbs of yoga. And then tadapi, even that, or that even, api means even that, bahirangam, nirbijasta, this is cool. Even that is an external part of nirbija, the external limb of seedless. Nirbija literally means no seed, without seed. Bija, seed. And nir means without. So this is a term we'll find in the Yoga Sutras. So there's a nirbija samadhi. There's a nirbija, a seedless samadhi, which means that I'm going to connect this to a statement Krishna makes. Krishna says that in the Gita, in chapter 2, that Vishayabhinivartante, that the sense objects literally draw away from you, they recede from you. So as you're pulling your senses in, the objects themselves, sights and sounds and smells, recede, they pull away from you. And Krishna says this happens niraharasya. Interesting to use the word ahara. To one who is, for example, fasting. If you fast, your body gets weaker, and your senses get weaker, and they kind of pull in. They're not, when you haven't eaten in a long time, it's hard to get excited about things out there. And so Krishna says you can do this. You can fast and pull your, and then the sense objects diminish. However, rasa varjam, even though you've given up this taste, this flavor of sense experience, rasopiyasya, you still have it. You still really have the taste. In other words, let's say someone, for example, I give this example before. This is a typical thing you find even in Christian monasticism and certainly among yogis, that, because they're very similar in some of the practices, that if they're having trouble with sex desire, let's say a person has made a decision not to engage in sex, but they're struggling with it. And so one of the strategies you find typically all over the world among monastic type people is that they fast. They'll fast, they just don't eat. And if you haven't eaten in a while, it's pretty hard to get excited. And so, especially if you haven't eaten in a real while, and you're kind of skinny. And so, but if you eat again, let's say you finally break your fast and sit down to a really good meal, as you start to eat again, the desires are there. Everything becomes activated again. And so that's related to this nirvija concept. I once spent a few months living out in this beautiful farm, actually where Govinda grew up, in Brazil, the these beautiful mountains in Brazil. And I remember before he was born, actually, I was there. And we had no electricity. And so it was great, actually, and that's a whole topic, living without electricity. And it was actually a wonderful experience. But anyway, I was involved there in helping to manage a farm. And if you have a field that you want to plant, and let's say it's overgrown with weeds and everything, you can come in and just cut all the weeds down and plant the field. But the seeds are still there, they'll grow back. If you really want to uproot the weeds, you've got to get into the soil, turn up the soil. And so you have this word in the Bhagavatam, actually in the very beginning of the Bhagavatam, unmulana, literally uprooting. And so nirvija, the difference between sabija, with a seed, and nirvija, samadhi, is that there's one samadhi in which by, in a sense, more or less by mechanical means, by fasting, by concentrating, by willpower, by discipline, by following the yamas and niyamas, by very diligent breathing and asanas, by all these somewhat mechanical and physical things, and with great determination, you come into a type of samadhi. But the seeds of those other desires are still there. You cut down the desire, but the seed is there under the surface. And that's why, it's very common that practitioners will say, oh my God, I thought I was past that. Like, I thought I was over that guy or that girl, or I thought I was over that anger, I thought I was... and then it rears its nasty head again. And the reason is because we achieved a type of samadhi, or whatever you want to call it, but it was sabita, the seed was there. And so Patanjali is saying that there is a nirvija samadhi. There's a samadhi in which it's uprooted, the seed is gone. It's not going to grow again, it can't grow again, because there's no seed. It's really gone. And he says that, interesting, it's very interesting. He says these three, dharana, dhyana, samadhi, are external in relation to that state of consciousness. It's almost like the divided line of Plato in the Republic, as this is to that, so that is to this. So, in other words, as the first 5 angas of yoga are to the last 3, so the last 3 are to this nirvija samadhi. So it's like going deeper and deeper in. And so the goal, obviously, is this nirvija samadhi where it's really gone. Your tendency, your propensity, your proclivity, your desire to exploit matter in any form, psychologically, emotionally, physically, is just gone. It can't come back, it's gone. And you really are, as they say in Sanskrit, jivan mukta, liberated even while living in this world. Like we have this saying in English, the living dead. So it's that sort of grammatically saying. Jivan, living, is the participle living, mukta, liberated. Even while living in this world, you're mukta, you're liberated. So, on time. So any question on that? To cover a few things.
I like that. Nirvija. How do you say it?
Nirvija?
Nirvija. Is that good with it too?
Excuse me?
Is it nirvija?
Oh, nirbijasya means of nirbija.
Okay.
Like the word bija, tasya, and yeah, it's a genitive of nirbija. The word would be nirbija or nirbija samadhi.
I'm wondering what the world was like when Patanjali and these others were developing this. It almost sounds like they were trying to escape, that things were so terrible. They were finding ways to escape to something better. The world must have been bad.
Very interesting point. One thing to keep in mind is that Patanjali is one of 6 important systems. And so, particularly in the yoga, in this Ashtanga yoga system, people would withdraw from society. So that, for example, in chapter 6 of Gita, when Krishna is describing it, it would be ekaki, alone, in a sacred place, alone, secluded place. So that certainly doesn't mean you need to be alone to practice, let's say, Hatha Yoga. But if one took the whole system as one spiritual path, then the recommendation was. So, you okay?
Yeah, all those axes going right now.
I wish we could help you. So, for example, in India, it's sort of a common thing that the yogis would go to the mountains, the Himalayan mountains, where they could sort of get away from it all because there were no Walmarts up there, no rickshaws. So particularly in this yoga system, they would get away. As far as the world being bad, from the transcendental perspective, the transcendentalist perspective, the world was not necessarily caught in, let's say, really in war, constant war, or economic depression, famine, plague. But even the ordinary world, just ordinary commerce, ordinary life, where people identify with their bodies and are selfish, just sort of this, the salt of the earth, selfish, nice people. That was considered to be kind of spiritual disaster in its own right. If you look at our present age is somewhat horrific. If you listen to popular culture. Also, there's another point, though, which I think is important. There's a powerful statement in the 7th canto, as it's called, often the 7th canto of the Bhagavatam, which is a much larger work than these words, by Prahlada, a 5-year-old boy who became this great saint. That's a very famous story. But anyway, Prahlada, in one of his famous prayers, he prays the Lord that I don't want to go to a secluded place like many of the yogis. He's not rejecting the yoga system. He's just saying, I don't want to go to a secluded place. He said, I want to stay where the people are and try to help them. And so there was this, Plato talks about when the person comes out of the cave, sees the light, and then goes back to the cave to help people. Now, Patanjali, of course, is composing this book, so he obviously cares about other people. He wouldn't have composed the Yoga Sutras. So he obviously is not, he cares about people. And so that's another one of the tensions in any spiritual culture, I think. To what extent you focus on your own practice, to what extent you help other people, what's the balance? And some people go too far to one side or the other. Some people are so self-sacrificing that they kind of damage themselves in some ways. And some people are so concerned about themselves that they kind of forget other people and they forget the world. And so this is one of the interesting tensions for the spiritual life, is what's the proper balance between self-concern and concern for others.